Dear colleagues, Ministry of Defense spokesperson Mr. Vilyen Pidgornyy will speak on Russia's military aggression in eastern Ukraine. Mr. Pidgornyy, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Let me give you a weekly update on the Russian aggression against Ukraine between July 24th and 30th. At the beginning of last week, the situation along the front line area demonstrated the tendency toward temporary stabilization. In the second half of the week, however, an escalation of hostilities was registered near Krasnohorivka and in Bakhmut highway area. The overall situation of the front line maintained the previous week's level of military action, ranging from 14 to 27 instances of ceasefire violations by the enemy per day. At the same time, the proportion of the use of prohibited by Minsk agreements weapons decreased considerably. We've registered 36 cases of last week, which is less than one-third of the total number of enemy shellings during the previous week. The highest number of ceasefire violations committed by Russia-backed militants was 27 on July 24th and the lowest 14 on July 29th. The number of shells and mortar bombs fired by the enemy at Ukrainian positions last week decreased dramatically in comparison with a week earlier and amounted to 169. Comparatively, a week earlier, there were 710 mortar bombs and artillery shells fired at Ukrainian strongholds. Now, we'll go to the more detailed information from the front line sector by sector. Luhansk sector. The situation was the tensest of all sectors as Russia-backed militants committed 3 attack attempts against Ukrainian armed forces last week. On July 24th, enemy forward group made an attempt to advance to positions of Ukrainian armed forces near Tryokhizbenka. However, upon detecting the movement of Russia-trained militants, Ukrainian service members opened direct fire and forced the enemy to retreat. The next day, on July 25th, Russian proxies attacked positions of Ukrainian army once again. Immediately after midnight, a group of Russian proxies advanced to positions of Ukrainian armed forces in the vicinity of Katerinivka. Ukrainian defenders, however, engaged in an hour-long combat with the enemy and disrupted the attack. In the morning of July 27th, pro-Russian militants opened fire with grenade launchers against Novotoshkivske. 5 minutes later, Ukrainian defenders observed the movement of the enemy forward group, consisting of up to 10 people. Ukrainian service members opened direct fire at that group. As a result of coordinated actions of our military, enemy was forced to retreat just 15 minutes later. The enemy also left behind a few pieces of military equipment. Last week, the daily number of ceasefire violations by the enemy ranged between 3 and 14. Now, Donetsk sector. The situation was relatively stable except for the few medium-intensity mortar attacks. On July 25th, Russia-equipped militants opened mortar fire against Pisky, having discharged nearly 20 mortar bombs. On July 27th, the invaders fired 10 mortar bombs at Avdiivka. Last week, the daily number of ceasefire violations by the enemy ranged between 3 and 8. Now we go to the Mariupol sector. Last week, the tensest situation in the sector was registered in Krasnohorivka. For 5 days out of 7, Russian proxies opened complex fire with mortars and machine guns against the town. Also, invaders occasionally engaged defense posts of Ukrainian army near Mariinka, Novotroitske, and in Pavlopil-Shirokino areas. For the most part, they used small arms. Last week, the daily number of ceasefire violations by the enemy ranged between 3 and 8. The intensity of the enemy air reconnaissance doubled last week. Ukrainian troops registered 13 episodes of hostile drones conducting aerial reconnaissance along the front line, out of which 8 episodes were recorded in the Donetsk sector alone. The remaining 5 in the Mariupol sector. No instances of enemy air scouting using drones were observed in the Luhansk sector. Last week, yet another 67th, this time, so-called humanitarian convoy from Russia illegally entered the territory of eastern Ukraine, which is temporarily not controlled by Ukrainian military. Reportedly, the convoy consisted of 60 trucks escorted by 12 vehicles. As per intelligence reports, the number of casualties amongst Russian proxies is 20 killed and 31 wounded last week. 2 Ukrainian servicemen were killed in action, and 23 servicemen were wounded in action. Our hearts go out to the families and friends of the fallen Ukrainian heroes who gave their lives defending Ukraine. Last week, 2 civilians were wounded by enemy hostile fire. One male was wounded in Toretsk on July 24th as a result of booby trap explosion. Another man was wounded in Maryan on July 27th as a result of enemy shelling of his residence. New residential areas in the front line came under enemy shelling last week. Power lines near Luhansk were damaged in an enemy fire. As a result, 250 consumers were cut off from electricity. Additionally, last week the enemy hit 2 buildings, a private home in Maryanka and a temporarily closed school in Toretsk. That'll be all for today. Thank you very much.